Hello and welcome to Empire Museum. Thank you very much for tuning in. We have a wonderful guest for you today. It is the great and powerful Hakim Adi. By way of introduction, he's currently Professor of the History of Africa and the African Diaspora at the University of Chichester. He was the UK's first history professor of African heritage. His research focuses on uncovering the history of Africa in Britain. He acknowledges how those of African descent played a significant but often neglected role in the history of Britain. By way of speciality, he looks into the 20th century to explore the influence of communism and Pan-Africanism on anti-colonial activism. He's also written 3 history books for children, a GCSE migration textbook. He's also an activist. He's founded the Young Historians Project to try and address why so few young people of African and Caribbean heritage engage with history at the university level and beyond. Overall, a distinguished gentleman, a very inspiring chap who's dedicated his life to make sure that these neglected stories are indeed properly told. And it was a pleasure to be able to chat with him for an hour or so. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. You are listening to Empire Museum with Joe Maynock. Britain has a selective amnesia about its past and prefers to brush many chapters under the historical carpet. Empire Museum audibly imagines an unsanitized appraisal of Britain's past and examines legacies still reverberating today. Hakim, welcome to the show. Thank you very, very much for coming on.
You're welcome anytime.
Just so you know, I've recorded a very flattering introduction for you in the pre-intro to this.
Great.
So people will be arriving at this moment in time with a good idea of your brilliance, so to speak.
Well, it's always good to have a little bit of flattery. I don't get it very often, so I can spoil myself or allow others to spoil me once a year.
Yeah, it's a little treat then. So to kick things off, if you could just explain to the folks at home why it's problematic to see the arrival of the Empire Windrush, June 22nd, 1948, docking at Tilbury, as a kind of linguistic and symbolic shorthand for both migration and the African and Caribbean presence in Britain at large, and why seeing it as this kind of watershed before and after event obscures historical reality.
Okay, sure. Well, I seem to have been spent most of my career trying to battle against the Windrush, as it were, or the Windrush moment. And as you've said, I think the first thing is it sort of eliminates, 2,000 years of history, or 2,000 years plus of history, which we don't want eliminated. We want to include that history, the fact that Britain has always been a country of migrants and of to some extent a diverse population, or a population more diverse than people would admit, and it's therefore important that we don't start looking at this history of Britain in 1948 just as we wouldn't look at the history of Britain in general starting in 1948. Why should we look at the history of the African diaspora in 1948? It makes no sense. As I say, it leaves out thousands of years of history. That's the first reason. The second is that it's a sort of arbitrary start, because the Empire Windrush was not the first troop-carrying ship to come from the Caribbean with Caribbean migrants in the post-war period. There were others that arrived before, and of course there were others that arrived afterwards. So the thing about Windrush is it was, filmed, and Lord Kitchener sang and so on, and so it's all captured for us. But it doesn't really, it's as I say, it wasn't the first of those post-war journeys, post-war troop ships. So it's a bit misleading to present it as something of such significance, where everything should be sort of dated from that moment in the summer of 1948. The other issue is that it is very often used as a kind of symbol of sort of mass post-war migration, and it's not that either, really, because sort of mass post-war migration, especially from the Caribbean, didn't really take off until the 1950s. So it's a bit misleading from that point of view. The other problem with it is that if we look at the sort of wide, broader history of the African diaspora, of course, there is an entire history of those who came from the Caribbean, which is extremely important. People who came in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and were for a time, the majority African diaspora population for a short time, from 1940s, 1950s to 1980s, something like that, for 40 years. But of course, they're not the majority African diaspora population today. The majority population comes from, or originates in, or has heritage directly from the African continent. So it's rather misleading in that way. And of course, if we go further back, again, people would have come not from the Caribbean, but most people would have come from Africa, or would have come from Africa via Europe and so on. So we're often presented with a history which is a kind of black British, to use that expression, history, or African diaspora history, which is very Caribbean focused. And although that focus is accurate, as I say, for a few decades, to make out that that everything should be focused on the Caribbean is very misleading. So for all of those reasons, I'm very reluctant to have the Windrush as a kind of symbolic moment.
Yeah, I think that's very well summarised, and in an effort to kind of further confront this historical myth, as it were, you argue and prove persuasively in some of the lectures that I've seen you do, that there was an African presence in Britain, for 2 millennia, going back to the Roman times and possibly even before. And I would just like you to elucidate a few key figures which were around during the Roman times, which kind of paint a diverse picture of Roman society, and just pick a few figures that people might find of interesting that prove this long lineage of African presence.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that we used to look at, Roman Britain as an example of that diversity, as people would say today. The fact that in Roman times, particularly in the third century of our present era, there were Africans here, or people of African heritage here, and the most well-known ones are those who were actually quite significant figures, like Septimius Severus, who was of Libyan, Berber origin, who was actually Roman emperor, died in Britain. There was another guy called Quintus Urbicus Lollicus, I think his name is, I always get his names mixed up, who was from Algeria, or what is today Algeria, also probably of Berber origin, and was a Roman governor of Britain in the same period. And there were African soldiers who were here, for example, stationed around Hadrian's Wall area in the northeast and so on. I mean, the most interesting sort of archaeological finds have been those in, I suppose, in York, like the so-called ivory bangle lady, who was a young woman of African heritage buried with ivory and jade bangles. And what, I suppose, what her remains show, and obviously these are just remains, and those of others that have been found in London and elsewhere, is that there were people of all, Africans of all ages here, children, women, people of high status, as the ivory bangle lady was. We don't quite know why they were here, or whether there were whole families here. And really, you could say that much more research needs to be done into who these people were, whether there are more skeletal remains that should be examined with that, with the aim of finding if they were of African heritage and so on. So it's all very, very exciting. However, having said that, I suppose people looked at the Roman era as sort of proving that Africans were here 2,000 years ago. But of course, with the recent findings about Cheddar Man, the whole notion of Britishness has changed, because Cheddar Man was around, or is, what we know of his remains were around about 10,000 years ago. And Cheddar Man was previously thought to be fair-skinned and fair-haired, and now he's thought to be dark-skinned and dark-haired. So, in other words, the earliest British people, the earliest Britons, look like Cheddar Man, with dark skin, dark hair, even though they had blue eyes. So, in other words, if you look at the whole notion of Britishness and diversity, it goes back very, very much further than the Roman Empire. People used to say, well, there were Africans here before the ancestors of the English, which Peter Fryer famously said. But in fact, Cheddar Man was here even long ago. What's important about Cheddar Man is that his genes are to be found in modern Britons. So the earliest modern Britons, I think maybe it was the Daily Telegraph that said that the ancient Britons were black. So in other words, or the first Britons were black, or whatever the headline was. So we need to think about the history of Britain, in short, in a very different way maybe than people have looked at it in the past.
Is this something that is still kind of an evolving field, like, because the techniques used to kind of uncover this and to contest these myths is like all done through DNA analysis and stuff like that. So is this something that we can expect to kind of see, we'll learn more about as the technology progresses?
I would think so, yeah. I think it's also quite expensive. So you tend to only get certain skeletons that are, examined for, whatever they do, examine teeth to see, they can take pieces of DNA and, draw various conclusions from it. I think it's quite expensive, so it's not done widely. But yes, I think if the techniques become more easily applicable, then, I think we're more likely to see all sorts of other discoveries. And there are already people, I say speculating, but have put forward, views that, there were many more visits to Britain from North Africa in particular in ancient times. So yeah, they're likely, I would imagine, to be more revelations in the future.
To make a slight jump, one other example I've heard you speak about is the figure Abbot Hadrian, deriving from the time of the Anglo-Saxons around the 7th century. I just wondered if you could talk to us about him? Because I think that's another fascinating example that would interest people.
Yeah, well, Abbot Hadrian was sent by the Pope, I think, in the 7th century. It may have been originally intended to be, or there was a suggestion that he might be Archbishop of Canterbury, which he apparently declined. But he came with the Archbishop of Canterbury in that period and is reputed, according to the Venerable Bede, who's the chronicler of those times, to have been a man, or it's usually translated as a man of African race, whatever that means exactly. But it's thought that, again, he was a Libyan, possibly of Berber origin again. I think rather than, the fact that he came from North Africa is significant. What he brought with him, some of the learning of North Africa, some of the literature of North Africa, and then the impact that he had on the Christian church and on sort of the education system, which of course was connected with the church at that time, and literature and learning was said to be significant. And more recently, people have begun taking note of him and writing about him a bit more. But yeah, he's another figure from this early period. I mean, there are others unnamed. What's important about him is we know his name and something about him. There are also sort of skeletons of other people during that period, that sort of early, I guess you'd say early medieval period, who we don't know who they were exactly, but it's been demonstrated that there were others of African heritage. So yes, I'm sure there'll be other discoveries in the future.
I found it interesting. I think it was in the introduction to Black British History that you wrote. You talked about how there would be Africans living and working in London during Shakespeare's time, and the idea that he is supposed to have fallen in love with an African woman referred to as Lucy Morgan, and celebrated her beauty and stuff.
Yes, I'm not sure how accurate that is. I mean, I think today that there's much more work again being done on the Tudor period, on the 16th century in particular, and several historians now working on that period. So we're getting much more information. But yes, I mean, essentially we know that there were probably hundreds of Africans in the country at that time. Again, probably some from North Africa, probably coming via Europe, and engaged in a variety of occupations, royal trumpeters, pin makers, divers, a whole range of occupations. Some musicians attached to the English court, some attached to the Scottish court. So yes, a whole variety of people, and mentioned in various official documents, including various letters connected with Elizabeth I, which have sort of been misinterpreted in the past. But what they do show is definitely this presence was significant and of significance at that time. And as I say, we're finding out much more about that period.
So some people may be taken aback by examples such as Septimius Severus, the black emperor who resided over Roman Britain, because they don't necessarily square with like modern day conceptions of race and prejudice. Like if people of colour experience such hardships today, how can it be that they could be emperor of a whole country 1,000 years ago? And I think that's, well, one explanation to that is this idea that race is a social construct, and that the development of racial ideas constitutes a relatively modern phenomena, and the emergence of race as a fixed and hard difference or a biological category bolstered by a pseudo-scientific separation of people into distinct racial groups. This kind of thinking only really arises alongside the transatlantic slave trade and colonial expansion. So with this in mind, if you could just link kind of evolving attitudes toward race and what relevance does that have towards your work into the African diaspora?
I think that, of course, there's always. I think you have to also see things sort of historically. So if we think about Europe, the 15th century, 14th century, and so on, most of the most advanced areas of Europe in terms of I suppose sort of intellectual development, you could say, were probably Iberia, Spain, Portugal, that were partly under the domination of Muslims. And some of those Muslims were North African, some came from Western Asia, and so on. So, the idea that people of African heritage were somehow inferior would have been, like a strange notion to have had during that period, because, as I say, the experience of people in Europe was the opposite, that those from Africa and elsewhere were often in superior positions. We also have to remember that even when Europe started its expansion in the 15th century, the aim of going to Africa was not to go there because it was thought to be a place of sort of barbarism or of savagery, but Europeans went there because they very, very clearly understood that Africa had those things that they didn't have, including gold, including spices, including some learning, and so on. So the attitudes were different, and of course people might have had funny ideas about the unknown and the people that were not so well known to them. But these ideas of African inferiority and other forms of modern racism, developed according to the conditions in Europe and the conditions in Africa, and those changed significantly, as you mentioned, with the human trafficking that began in the late 16th century, particularly in the 17th century as far as England was concerned, and the colonial domination of, firstly, of the Caribbean in particular, and then the importation of enslaved Africans. So it then became necessary, you could say, to explain that phenomena and that relationship with Africa, between Britain and Africa, or between Europe and Africa. And racism kind of emerged in that context, just as you could look at, I suppose, like anti-Irish racism in the same way. Anti-Irish racism, in fact, developed earlier in some ways because the colonial relationship between England and Ireland was much older than the colonial relationship between England or Britain and Africans. So I think that, racism has to be understood, as I say, as a consequence of political and economic relationships and how they developed over the centuries. And clearly treating African men, women and children as subhuman, or not even human, not alone subhuman, which is what increasingly occurred in the 17th century, and particularly in the 18th century. Then the powers that be needed a rationale, an explanation for all of that. So that is really how racism developed. And then as empire developed in the 19th century, as you said, you then get more kind of pseudo-scientific versions of it. So rather than just thinking about African inferiority in general, you then get people claiming, kind of some kind of pseudo-scientific justification for that by, measuring people's heads or bodies or arms or legs or whatever it might be, and trying to prove this inferiority. And again, this was also done with not just with Africans or people from Asia, but also people from Europe and also women. The idea that women had smaller heads and therefore were less intelligent and so on. So all this is nonsense, but one has to see it emerging from the political and economic relationships which existed at the time.
Have you ever thought about the connection between the omission of African presence in Britain with notions of civilizational nationalism? Because it seems to me that there's a tendency in nationalist thought to be able to consume like the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings and the Normans, etc., into like nationalism's guise, and then at some point after the Tudors, it seems that like entry is kind of closed and therefore acceptance becomes harder after that. And I'm sort of reminded of some of the rhetoric espoused by prominent nationalists like Enoch Powell, who talked about the kind of defending the English genius and had this bizarre, incorrect view of culture as something static and fixed. I think he made a speech in the early 60s, the olive tree speech, about this kind of desire for an unsullied type of Englishness, which of course has to ignore large swaths of history to be able to advocate anything like that. So I wondered if you've ever made the connection between these kind of nationalist myths of Englishness and then their connection with the tendency to like falsify history.
Well, it's a sort of long tradition. I mean, you've picked out one particularly notorious racist, but I mean there is quite an ancient one, but I mean they're much more contemporary ones, because this is the kind of thing that Michael Gove and Johnson and others engage in.
Yeah.
It's a complete, they distort history on every front. So, I mean, Gove is a good example because he was obviously Education Secretary, whatever that was, 10 years ago or something, and, wanted to present a history of Britain, which was a history of the white men of property. And so, which excluded people of African heritage, people of Asian heritage, workers, women, everybody, essentially. That was his proposal, and I don't know whether you remember, but that was very vigorously opposed by nearly everybody. So we shouldn't think that there's this kind of ancient history. It's very, very modern history. And in fact, we see it today with the whole issue of statues and so on, and so there are attempts to present a very particular kind of history, which is a history of the white men of property, and so that excludes everybody. And when you present the history of the white men of property, it's a history of empire and colonialism and enslavement and all these kinds of things. And of course, it's inconvenient then and it's a history of racism, essentially, as well, and of exploitation and so on. So it tends to remove everybody else, or to present the majority of people in the world in a subservient and inferior position, or to write them out of history altogether. So it's a very dangerous history, and those who present history in that distorted way present every aspect of history in a distorted way. So, for example, at the commemorative events connected with the First World War, Gove and Johnson were, again, just to use those two as an example, were the loudest cheerers for, like, it was what a glorious war it was. and it was all about defending Western civilization and poor little Belgium and all this nonsense. The most reactionary lies. The First World War had nothing to do with defending Western civilization or defending Belgium. It was a war to redivide the world, including to redivide Africa between the big powers. So my point is that when those who present a distorted view of one aspect of history generally present a distorted view of all aspects of history, and for very clear, or with clear political aims and intentions. Anyway, one of the consequences of all that is that they tried to make out that the agents of change in history, if you like, are either the agency of change is mysterious, or it's the white men of property, both of which are not true. Whereas the majority of people, in fact, it is the majority of people who are the agents of change. But that tends to, the aim of such people is to distort that view and create pessimism about everything. Everything is mysterious and unchangeable and so on. So history shows the opposite. Everything changes, and it's the people who change things. So the powers that be don't like that. They try to distort it. So anyway, that's how I would see all these characters. That's their aim and intention.
Yes, and might I add that Nigel Farage has been on the radio and named Enoch Powell as his political hero. And I think the kind of patriotism which leads to this delirious national optimism seems to be evident in both the handling of Brexit and COVID. But about your point that the corollary of distorting history obscures the agents of change and tends to focus on white men of property over the masses, if we could look at that argument through the lens of abolition, I think that'd be interesting, because over the summer I saw a tweet by Andrew Neil. I forget I don't know the quote, but the gist of it was framing abolition as something that absolved all previous sins of the British Empire, and very keen to extol the virtues of the Navy and the abolitionists themselves. But obviously narrativizing the process in this manner obscures a lot and forgets to mention a lot. So I was wondering if you could sketch out what's lost in these kind of narratives.
Yeah, I think that's again the sort of white men of property's view of history. That it was their parliament that did this, and it was their navy that did that. But I think the question has to be asked, why? First, the question is, why does the world's leading human trafficker in the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, decide to be the world's greatest abolitionist? So that question has to be answered, has to be explained. The key thing about abolition is that it was, you can say, largely the act of the enslaved. That it was the enslaved who waged a 200-year plus war of liberation to end enslavement and to make the slave system unprofitable and unsustainable. And the greatest victory in that was the victory of the 500,000 Africans and their allies in the French colony of Saint-Domingue that became Haiti, that we know as Haiti. So that revolutionary struggle was extremely important. It had a very profound effect on Britain and on the powers that be in Britain for a variety of reasons. One being that they feared that revolutionary activities would spread to their own colonies and could end up overthrowing the entire slave system. So that concentrated their minds very greatly. Secondly, in the context of the wars against revolutionary France, the anyway, what occurred in Haiti sort of changed the balance of power, as it were, in favour of Britain, and they were determined to stop exporting enslaved African resources to their economic rivals, essentially the French and the Spanish. And it's sometimes forgotten that Britain's human trafficking didn't just involve Britain's colonies. The enslaved Africans were not just exported to Britain's colonies, but also to the French, Spanish, and others. So the essential decision was that was it in Britain's interest to stop that trafficking? And the decision was that it was. And so that was taken in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. And the Foreign Slave Act, I think as it was called, effectively then taken in the interests of Britain's human traffickers, or those who used enslaved Africans and others, then put a big dent in the entire human trafficking business, as it were. And as I say, then there was the consideration about whether it was useful for British colonies to import more potential revolutionaries and so on. So these were the kinds of considerations that were taken. These were kind of political, military considerations. At the same time, there were all kinds of economic contradictions that were being worked out, as it were, between different sections of the rulers, whether those who were more interested in slave produce in particular, or those who were more interested in manufacturing and so on. So those things have to also be taken into account. And then thirdly, there was the voice of the masses of the people that in the 1880s and 1890s in Britain had shown their massive opposition to human trafficking and so on. So that also has to be taken into account. So all of these factors go into explaining, and others that I haven't got time to go into, but those are some of the most important things, have to be taken into account when looking at why Parliament took a decision which it thought was in the interests of the rich and powerful in Britain. And that was the main consideration. What is in the interests of the rich and powerful, and not what is in the interests of Africans. And the evidence for that is that the actual enslavement of Africans continued for another 30 or so years. The other thing about the naval squadron, and I think Marika Sherwood's work shows this very well, a book after abolition, it goes into it in some detail. The first thing was that the naval patrol, which Britain used against all the other major countries in the world, sometimes with their agreement, sometimes not, it gave the powers that be in Britain the ability to poke their noses into everybody else's business, to maraud across the Atlantic, to make sure that their navy dominated the entire Atlantic Ocean and so on, and then gave themselves the powers to do that, which they'd secured during the wars against France and Spain and so on. The other thing is that even during that period, there were massive sort of breaches of that, those abolitionist laws, and British citizens and the citizens of other countries engaging in what were essentially sort of illicit and illegal smuggling activities and so on. And the use of the existence of slavery in many places which were British colonies continued in some forms right up until the beginning of the 20th century. And the use of slave-produced products, both in Africa and in the US in particular, as well as in other countries, Brazil, Cuba and so on, where British capital was employed, also continued throughout the 19th century. So that's it's quite a lot to think about there. But All of this has to be taken into account when we just say, oh, Britain did this or Parliament did this. It actually has to be looked at why it was done, and actually what were the consequences. And it's not quite as simple as the pretense that the white men of property were wonderful and they did all these things because they were Christians and so on. No, that's not the situation at all.
That's brilliantly put, and I do sincerely hope that I could get Andrew Neil to listen to your retort there, because I think he could learn a thing or two from listening to that.
Well, good luck.
I've not got a chance, but I can hope. Right, so one thing I wanted to ask you about is migration, and I think it's sort of linked to the themes of African diaspora and sort of having a more bird's eye view of history, which I think is helpful, would be helpful for more people to have that nowadays, because I think it would combat more contemporary racism. If you could just briefly kind of sum up why we should not treat both Windrush migration and contemporary migration as this kind of irregular phenomenon, and in fact one that has a long history, obviously taking into account a sort of a bird's eye view of migration across the ages and how it's a natural part of human existence.
Sure. Well, I mean, we can go back to, Cheddar Man. So Cheddar Man was a migrant. And, when I talked to some people in the Home Office a few weeks ago, I said, well, if the Home Office had been around when Cheddar Man was around, they wouldn't have let him in. And then there'd be no British people because he's the ancestor of, well, anyway. So, Britain is an island into which there have been migrants continually. The Romans were migrants, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Normans were migrants, the Hanoverians were migrants, the royal family are migrants, or the descendants of migrants. There have been Irish migrants, there have been Huguenot migrants, there have been, Jewish migrants, there have been Indian migrants, African migrants, Caribbean migrants, Syrian migrants. I mean, that's the nature of Britain, and always has been over the centuries. So that's a history that people should understand. I think that's one way of looking at it. The other is I guess to understand the way that, having said that migration is often used by the powers that be to sort of create confusion amongst people and to put it simply, to turn various types of people or various people into scapegoats for the inadequacies of the economy and economic system that exists in the country. And that happens today with people coming from Europe or refugees and asylum seekers in exactly the same way that it happened to people in the 1940s and 1950s coming from Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. Exactly the same things are said. That it's a drain on this and it's a drain on that. And it's not possible for human beings to be a drain, because human beings create all the wealth in society. They produce the taxes, they do everything. So how can you can't, it's just ludicrous to say that migration is something that's bad or unhealthy. The fact that there may be shortages of things is there are shortages because the system is not being invested in as it should. So you take the NHS, there might be big queues and whatever, but that's not because people are coming from Poland or somewhere. It's because the NHS isn't expanding. There's not investment in it in the way there should be. It's being privatised and so on. So anyway, the point is that these things are presented in a certain way in order to create confusion, in order to get people, blaming each other rather than putting the blame, where it should be. And this is constantly done. I mean, you mentioned Brexit earlier without getting into a big discussion about Brexit. And one thing that one could say about the entire Brexit campaign as a whole is that it was conducted in one can say, a spirit of disinformation and racism. No, that's not. I'm not talking about any particular individuals or campaign. I'm talking about the entire thing. Mm. So then nobody understands what it's about. You could say, which is, or nobody understands what the EU is about either. That's it. Or there's a lot of confusion about it. So, the EU, what is the EU? The EU is an organization of the big powers and the big monopolies in Europe. So is it good for the majority of people? No, it's not good. It's quite simple. It's a bit like talking about NATO. NATO is a military organization of the big powers and big monopolies in Europe. Is it a good thing? No, it isn't. So if somebody tomorrow said, should Britain come out of NATO, I would say yes, definitely.
It's got lots of colonial sort of legacies in the founding fathers of NATO as well. I think
sure.
Lots of hangovers.
Exactly. And if somebody tomorrow says, should Britain come out of the EU, I would say yes, definitely, because it's the same kind of organisation, which also, incidentally, has those colonial relationships with the countries of Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and so on. But the problem is these things are not discussed in that way. They're kind of discussed in a different way, which creates confusion about them. I don't think anybody would discuss NATO from the point of view of, do you love people in France and the US and Canada? Nobody would think of it like that. That's a stupid way of looking at it. It is what it is. So, but unfortunately, anyway. So, people have to, I think what's important when we look at history, hopefully, is that we firstly look at things in terms of their entire history. And it's quite interesting. I don't know to what extent people look at the whole history of the EU and what preceded it and what its whole kind of Cold War antecedents and so on, just as one would look at NATO in that way as a kind of Cold War organisation and so on. So history hopefully gives us that broad view, the critical view as well as to who has made the decision about these things. Are these organisations which the people of Europe have got together and said, wouldn't it be wonderful to have this? No, they haven't. They've never said that. This is something which governments have presented. So, in history, one always wants to look at, who are the decision makers, whose interests are these decision makers representing, what was the involvement of the majority of people, and so on. I think that, that's a very important way of looking at the world in general. And, history can give us that orientation, that vantage point, that way of that outlook when we look at anything, when we judge anything that's going on in the world.
Just one final quick question whilst I still have you. You speak about how change comes about through the people, and I just wondered, in terms of your work on advocating for the proper representation of the African diaspora, like, where do you think we are in 2020 in terms of its progression? Because obviously, in contrast to when you were growing up, we must have made some big progresses, but I wondered if what you think in terms of how far there is to go in terms of making it more mainstream, and maybe tying that into the importance of getting people educated about this from a young age.
Yeah, I think it's important to have, this kind of broad view of history, that no one should be excluded from history, and everybody should understand that, yes, there are people who look like them in history, who have done great things and not such great things, and that's very important. It's also important, as you say, to understand who are the key actors in history. That history is about change and how that change is brought about. So I think that over the last 50 years, of course, there have been those changes that people have struggled for them. People have demanded that the history of Africa, the history of the Caribbean, the history of African and Caribbean people in Britain is important. It has to be recognised as a kind of right. And I think we're making those advances. There's some understanding of that. We've still got a way to go with schools and with universities and with media. But we've made some advances, but there's still a way to go. That's how I would sum it up.
Yes, I understand. I think that is well summed up. So I'll leave it there for today. But I'd just like to thank you very much for giving up your time and coming on. I think you've provided some wonderfully cogent and detailed answers. So thank you very much, Hakim.
You're very welcome, and thanks for saying so. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome.